I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get On Board, and this is Women Get On Board in Conversation. Our Women Get On Board in Conversation series are about impacting and empowering our members to be more effective and to serve and lead on boards with courage and confidence. And today, I'm delighted to have Heather Laxton, who is a corporate governance expert, professional, and principal of GovRight Consulting. Heather is going to speak about the impact of Canada's Modern Slavery Act on board of directors. I followed Heather, and she had an article recently in the Governance Gazette on this topic in October. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you. So maybe let's just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at GovRight Consulting.
Sure. Well, Deborah, as you know, I've sort of spent the balance of my career working in the mining industry, particularly with small cap companies. And, it became apparent to me quite quickly that these smaller companies would really benefit from the advantages of having a dedicated governance officer for the provision of governance advice and corporate secretarial support, but it's often, not feasible from a cost standpoint. So, having a dedicated person in that role is sometimes just not in reach. So I was seeing a lot of these companies turn to outsourced support for what I would call compliance based corporate secretarial support. So I founded initially GovRight in 2013, really to fill that gap and to respond to that growing need for reliable corporate governance expertise and fulsome fractional corporate secretarial support for smaller cap companies. After spending the last 8 years working in-house, I've now returned to my consulting life, and through GovRight, I'm able to offer bespoke board governance advisory services and robust fractional corporate secretarial support, which is really designed to give growing companies the advantages of a full-time governance officer without the commensurate cost. That's really what I'm up to.
Well, Heather and I, just by way of background, met through, I don't know if it was a conference at the Governance Professionals of Canada. And the two of us, I would have to say, are very keen on good. And over the years, we've had great discussions. So Heather, you're well suited for the role at GovRight. And I know that you will serve many corporations, in particular in the mining industry, with great governance knowledge and experience that you have.
Thank you.
Delighted to have you. So maybe you can give us a brief understanding of Canada's Modern Slavery Act and the key provisions of the Act. I know you're well read on it, you've written about it, but maybe just high level, because we really try to focus our conversations on what do directors need to be thinking about.
Sure. So, this really kind of came about, I think one of the catalysts anyways was in 2022, a collective of the International Labor Organization, along with the International Organization for Migration and a human rights group called Walk Free, they published a report which reported at the time that 28 million people are trapped in forced labor globally. And this actually represented an increase of 2.7 million since 2016. So this form of, modern slavery really is occurring in almost every country in the world. And Canada is no exception. We've got a number of imported everyday products that we all use, electronics, clothing, and these are at risk of being produced by child or forced labor. And in fact, a supply chain risk report put out by World Vision in 2013, this year, estimates that the value of these imported goods in this country, goods produced by child or forced labor, sits at an estimated value of $48 billion. So, this is certainly a significant issue. And the Canadian government has joined other jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom, Australia, France, Germany, to name a few, who are introducing measures to compel businesses and government institutions alike to take steps to prevent, the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. So this legislation was formerly known as Bill S-211. It's now commonly referred to, as you stated at the beginning, as Canada's Modern Slavery Act. It passed third reading on May 3rd and received royal assent on May 11th of this year. So it will come into force on January 1 of 2024, with the first reports due under this legislation at the end of May next year. So this is coming fast. The act applies to a broad segment of Canadian businesses and federal government bodies operating in Canada with within a certain threshold of annual revenue. It includes any government institution that produces, purchases, or distributes goods anywhere in the world, and any Canadian linked entity that produces, sells, or distributes goods anywhere in the world, imports goods into Canada, or controls an entity that's involved in any of these activities. So it casts a wide net, certainly. Effectively, the Act focuses on transparency, really, to encourage better practices. And this is going to be brought about by imposing reporting obligations on entities that are, that are going to be subject to this Act. So as I said, by May 31st of each year, and that starts in 2024, businesses that are subject to this Act are going to be required to report to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness in a prescribed report, which is detailed in the legislation. And they'll have to report on the steps that they've taken during the previous financial year to prevent and reduce the risk that child or forced labor was used at any step in the production of goods made by the entity or imported into Canada. So, it will be quite an undertaking. These reports are also going to be required to be made publicly available in a prominent place, as stated in the legislation. This would be something like on your website, as an entity's website, or through a public registry that's going to be accessible through the website of the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. So an additional imposition on entities that are incorporated under the Canadian Business Corporations Act or any other federal statute is that they will be required to provide these reports, these annual reports, to their shareholders along with their annual financial statements. So there's quite specific obligations here. I think it's also really important to note that this Act includes some very significant enforcement powers, including verification of compliance by way of searching any premise, and that includes like a private residence. So that is, of course, when there's reasonable grounds to search. So we've really seen a deliberate attempt here to include mechanisms, for enforcement. The other thing I think really important to note is that the consequences for failure to comply with the requirements of this Act include fines of up to $250,000. And that fine can be imposed for simple failure to file the report. But of particular importance is the fact that the government has indicated its intention to hold directors and officers accountable for the required disclosure. And so, this is notable, and beyond the financial consequences that can be imposed by the legislation, there's additional costs from regulatory enforcement and litigation, including class actions, which could be significant.
Heather,
so it's important.
Can we pause for a minute? Because that was a lot.
I know, but I didn't, you put one question and there was so much. So I was like,
You know so much. So I just want to kind of step back because that was a lot. And I set the stage, and, I think there's a lot of people that is like, oh my God, I didn't realize the size. I didn't realize the scope. I didn't realize the compliance. I didn't realize the reporting deadlines. So, and we're really bringing it back, like you had said, that there's fiduciary duty and responsibilities of serving directors of board members.
Yeah.
So what are some things that, implications that could impact board of directors if they don't comply or they don't report, or et cetera, et cetera? Because I think the stage that we're in right now is it's going to be a question of who's your outside consultant, who are your advisors, who's going to help you get to this compliance stage. Be a big transition. So, but what should board members, and I know this is going to be a broad question, what should they be asking, and what are the implications if they don't?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to note is that the legislation requires that these reports are approved and, in fact, signed, evidenced with a signature of one or more members of the entity's governing body. So that's first and foremost. As a director, you may be asked to sign off on this, with your signature. So this has led to questions about whether or not individuals signing the reports can also be held personally liable for misrepresentations. And based on the current wording of the legislation and the fact that the government has signified its intent to hold directors and officers accountable, it certainly does seem that directors who authorize or participate in knowingly providing false or misleading information could be personally fined as well. So, or face criminal prosecution. So this is the first thing I would sort of say that boards want to be aware of. The second thing would be that in terms of what should boards be doing, how can they prepare? First and foremost, if you're not sure whether or not this act applies to your organization, would be to check with the general counsel and get to the bottom of that. In the event that it does, the first thing I would advise boards to do is analyze the risks, right? Even if you source your materials from relatively low risk jurisdictions, go deeper, look for modern slavery risks deeper in your supply chain. Seek to identify any gaps in your entity's systems and processes, review your policies, or develop them where the case may be. And this, of course, includes procurement and supplier identification and selection processes. So there's quite a bit there. Questions, right? Boards should be asking questions, hopefully before today, but if not, no time like the present. Does the company have the appropriate resources that it needs in place to assess the risks of modern slavery internally and within its supply chain? Has management done its due diligence on the supply chain? Does it understand the supply chain and the extent of its and its reach? Has there been training provided to staff to identify risks and to detect modern slavery issues? What will the reporting structure be in terms of senior management, up to senior management and from senior management to the board? What will that reporting structure look like with respect to supply chains, their structures and the exposure that supply chain may have to these risks? And also, has the board, the board should be looking at how it's going to be reporting, what information is going to be included, what form will the statement take, where will it be posted? And so companies, I really think boards and companies generally should be prepared for the possibility that these reports could attract some public attention.
So question for you, because a lot of times work like that and compliance usually sometimes fits within a committee of the board, a standing committee. And there's a lot of debate around having ESG committees, because this is falling straight in the S for social, right? Under that. Where do you think that responsibility, that delegation or that committee within the board most likely would be leaning in from a committee perspective? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the first most obvious place for it would be the audit committee, who sort of oversees risks, oftentimes generally, unless there's a standalone, risk committee. So that might be one place for it to live. If the board happens to have its own ESG committee separately, or some subcommittee that deals with social issues of these natures, then that would be the place. But I would stress, of course, as everyone is aware, that the board can't delegate the responsibility, so it certainly does have to come back up.
I meant more leaning in a committee that then will report up to the board, and it's ultimately the board that will be approving it. So I didn't.
Of course, yeah, but these committees should be going a little deeper than the board would to get to the root of things.
And where are you seeing? So obviously, this is going to keep you busy with your clients that you're working on, in particular in the mining industry, right?
Yes.
Are you obviously best practices are just evolving, right? Because we're just going into a new regime of reporting on this, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the design and implementation of a process to identify modern slavery risks in an entity's entire operation and or those of its subsidiaries, and additionally, the operations of all parts of its supply chain is a substantial undertaking, a substantial exercise. So I don't think this is anything that would be undertaken lightly, but given the risks of inaction, it's certainly something that should have our attention.
Well, and it goes way beyond the, OSC's comply or explain, right? That was kind of a comply or explain why you don't have diversity. This is comply or there's financial penalties, right?
Yes. Well, with respect to the reporting requirement, certainly that's the case. The legislation doesn't go so far as to mandate companies to change things, but it certainly is requiring transparency, and that that is sort of the core of the comply or explain model that we've seen and adopted here in Canada, which is really encouraging better practices through the requirement to disclosure practices. So I think that's really what the spirit here is intended behind this legislation.
So Heather, we could continue this conversation for quite some time. I know how passionate you're on it, but I'm mindful of our time together. So maybe are there some key takeaways you'd like our audience to go away with, and where can they learn more about you?
Yeah, well, I hope the takeaway from our discussion today, and I know I've provided an absolute abundance of information, but certainly, as I said just a bit earlier, there's a material risk here of inaction. So I think the key takeaway is that I hope boards are focusing on this, and if they're not, they need to. And I think the second part of this is, of course, it goes without saying that respect for human rights is a corporate imperative. And so certainly boards need to be considering legal, financial, and reputational risks alike, in terms of how they're approaching this new reporting requirement, and in ensuring that they're prepared to report starting in May of next year.
Wow. You've shared a lot with us. If people want to learn more about you, where can they go to find out?
Well, I have a website, so certainly visit my website. It's govright.ca. I'm live and active on LinkedIn, both personally and through GovRight. I do have, as you said, a blog that I try to keep up. It's called the Governance Gazette, and I tend to really focus my posts there on things that I think people should pay attention to. So I don't post necessarily as often as other blogs, but when I post, it's usually something that people need to read.
Well, you got my attention when you posted. So anyway, that's it for Women Get on Board in Conversation. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your insights and your wisdom with our Women Get on Board community.
Thank you so much again for the invitation. It was my absolute pleasure being here.
Thank you. And to find more resources for your board journey or to join Women Get on Board, we're now more than 850 members strong. Visit our womengetonboard.ca.